Economist Professor Patrick Bond is in the studio with us to talk about the significance of this visit. As we mentioned, that it's the first foreign leader that's been invited back to the UK. And President Ramaphosa earlier on went to attend the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. So is it something that South Africa should consider indeed the president as an honor?
Oh, yes. I mean, the last state visit was Donald Trump, 2019, and you remember he fumbled around with the late Queen Elizabeth standing in front of her, all the etiquette he just blew. So we know that President Ramaphosa is very smooth, and he'll be very well appreciated because especially new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will have a chance to sit with him, and he really needs a credibility boost of being with Africa's most high-profile leader.
So let's just talk about credibility. We'll start with the fact that obviously this comes on the back of COP27, and I want to look at Britain's role in that, particularly in relation to Africa and South Africa directly. I mean, there was much speculation about what it would bring to the party, and criticism here in South Africa about the package deal that South Africa has taken on from the West, considering what the West itself is not doing or doing in return in terms of fossil fuels.
Yes, and Rishi Sunak, although it was obviously in train for the last year, he was only able to present really the most stingy of the five donors there. There was the US, which had $1 billion market rate loan guaranteed by the US government, so no risk, so that should be easy. For the Brits, it was only $500 million. It was $500 million, plus 24 million in grants. So peanuts. The Germans, the French, and the EU as a whole did much better in at least bringing down the overall package. So it's somewhat respectable. It'll cheapen South Africa's debt load, and Eskom needs cheaper debt. The big question is, should South Africa be repaying some of the loans? Eskom borrowed from Medupi for Kusile. There were corrupt loans. There was odious debt. The ANC had been effectively bribed by Hitachi through Chancellor House. And I think that's the sort of question activists and environmentalists are asking. Why isn't Britain just taking the haircut and writing off some of that? And particularly because the pledges in general for Africa have been very, very low. They're on adaptation to try to prepare us, to make us more resilient. Only about 2/3 as much as in Glasgow when Britain hosted last year. So a disappointing situation where just symbolically, where Rishi Sunak didn't even want to go to this UN climate summit, had to be kind of teased into doing so by his colleagues.
And I want to latch on to the moral point that you make about whether or not Britain shouldn't absolve, or even if it was reducing the loan for South Africa, as you mentioned, on those corrupt debts. Would Rishi Sunak enjoy the mandate to do so, given the fact that he's come in on the ticket that he's going to fix the mistakes of the previous administration? Of course, that also means dealing better with money and not seeming like he's throwing it in the water when Britons themselves are saying we're in much greater need of. But there is a moral argument to be made, as you say there. And would it be something that King Charles would weigh in on? Because it's not really his purview, is it?
Well, I hope he would, because he's got this sort of moral standing, has been an environmentalist, someone concerned about the welfare of the poor in Britain. He's been here, working even in Hillbrow. And so there's a certain stature, and he needs to have the prestige that comes with trying to manage these problems, especially because the House of Windsor itself has a slavery debt, right? A colonial debt. Certainly Charles's ancestors got stinking rich out of being slave owners. And so there's much comment as Queen Elizabeth passed away that there's some unfinished business. There's even, crown jewels, the Cullinan diamond. But you're also right that Rishi Sunak is an extremely conservative finance minister. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer under Boris Johnson. And for a while, they were doling out money during the COVID crisis, so there was a big debt. And then he came in a very harsh way in the last year and was, bragging, I would take money away from poor people and give it to richer areas. And he was cutting the budget. He sort of like an Enoch Godongwana, really doing harsh austerity. So I don't expect, aside from some feel-good rhetoric, there to be any real money on the table. And that includes for the African continent, where historic British emissions have really done a lot of damage. So there is a huge climate debt, a reparations bill to be paid.
And just speaking about rhetoric, the whole concept of continuity and change, I mean, that was used when King Charles III stepped in. He certainly made a pledge to continue along the vein, the tone that his mother kept in terms of the running of the monarchy. Now, when it comes to reparations, for instance, she was one whom Britain spoke to directly, and African countries who felt that Britain needed to take responsibility about this issue of reparations. So I'm just wondering here, how far can President Cyril Ramaposa push in terms of keeping to what Queen Elizabeth II did, and in modernizing the monarchy where King Charles III can take it? Where does it begin and end? Because, as you said, there's rhetoric and there's rhetoric.
And for Prince Charles, his strength is speaking from a moral standpoint to his ruling class, to the British corporates. And so we did see something last month, which Lord Peter Hain, born in South Africa, managed to push through the House of Lords, which was a ban on a company, Bain & Company, a consultancy that had helped to wreck our South African Revenue Service. There are plenty more in the City of London, right? There are plenty more of these financial scammers, and South Africa is being put on a grey list. It looks pretty definite by the Financial Action Task Force, so the international financial authorities. And much of the illicit financial outflows, sure, they go to tax havens, but to the City of London. There's also licit financial outflows. Don't forget that when we lost many companies, Anglo, De Beers, Old Mutual, SAB, the big beer company now, Anheuser-Busch, Investec, I could go on. They went to London. This was in 1999. And I think in that sense, the old colonial ties, which went through corporates, Cecil Rhodes, and big banks like Barclays and Standards, had been fraying during apartheid. Sanctions broke some of those. But then these big boys here in Johannesburg ran away to London. And I think that's one of the great tragedies, is that South Africa, half the world's gold under our feet at one point here in Johannesburg, but the profits end up in London. I hope some of that will, for a very savvy businessman like Cyril Ramaposa, be the basis of a moral outrage to try to get better terms.
Just a quick one. I want to look at the bid by Africa to push for AU membership at the G20. Is it something that you think King Charles will be found to be a sincere supporter here? And I'm not just talking about murmurings of support that will, allay whatever vexatious issues can come out from him not wanting to support. Is it something that he would support?
Well, I would hope so, because, again, he has a sort of moral standing, but he, don't forget, isn't really allowed to do very much. He wasn't even allowed to go to Egypt by Rishi Sunak. And then the big dilemma for the G20 is that we didn't really see President Ramaphosa mobilizing. He had Macky Sall, the Senegalese president, head of the AU. He had Paul Kagame, head of the AU Development Agency. But we really never saw that issue come to the table in Indonesia on was Wednesday and Thursday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Those 2 days had so many other problems to deal with, especially Russia, Ukraine. The G20 tried to do things like understanding that the world interest rate increases are going to be devastating. We have probably about 50 countries that are close to bankruptcy. And then, of course, there was a $1.4 billion vaccine fund, a pandemic fund to help countries, but that's small change. And the real prize would have been to revisit the WTO meeting where South Africa didn't really get its intellectual property waiver on these very vital COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. So quite unsatisfactory, the whole G20 experience. And so AU will not be a member now. Maybe next year when it's hosted by India, there'll be a bit better of a mood.
And speaking of unmet needs and promises, just a quick one on COP27. It's been extended somewhat to deal with particularly climate financing, which is something that is important to African countries. What are your predictions here, and do you think there will be a significant enough win? Is it something that we can lay claim to, that we made some progress?
Well, a little progress insofar as that deal, the 8.5 billion was set, but it has so many unsatisfactory aspects, the high interest rates. But, you know, I think the fact that our Environment Minister, Barbara Creasy, was given a very important position in managing a committee, along with her Danish counterpart, to deal with the loss and damage. So that's the sort of code word for saying when you have a Durban rain bomb, a flood that hits 500 people die, tens of billions of rands damage, who's going to pay? Well, it's been terribly unsatisfactory. The poor people of Durban don't even have a sewage system working now, and the beaches are still closed. So those loss and damage funds should be coming to South Africa, indeed from South Africa. And the tragedy is that Barbara Creasy had to postpone till next year. Next year, the COP28 will be in the United Arab Emirates, which is a pretty tough place, just as much of a sort of US-backed, oligarchy as Egypt is a dictatorship. So I do feel that this COP process begins to hit the ceiling. We saw it in Durban in 2011. It's quite unsatisfactory, and it's, as Greta Thunberg, the Swedish environmental activist, has said, blah, blah, blah.
Well, thanks a lot for that. Much appreciated. Patrick Bond, Professor Patrick Bond is a political economist speaking to us about various issues, particularly President Cyril Ramaphosa's visit to the UK.